A break from the Bucks action to talk trades. OG Anunoby, a Pacers target, to the Knicks. What do the Raptors do now? What do the Pacers do now? Plus, a key contract deadline coming for the Pacers and more trade talks. Hawks tonight. Lots to talk about on today's Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, y'all? Happy Friday. Congrats. You made it through the week, and welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today, a lot to talk about. A week late because the Bucks got in the way and was way more important to talk about the most in-demand topic this week. But the end of the rivalry is over now. The season series is over now. It's time to go back in time. On December 30th, a week ago now, OG Anunoby was traded from the Raptors to not the Pacers, the New York Knicks to be exact, and it did influence the Pacers game last weekend. We alluded to it. But what does that actually mean for the Pacers? Where do the Raptors go now? Plus, a contract deadline coming for the Pacers this week, and more trade thoughts, and they play the Hawks tonight in a trap game, question mark? Lots to talk about today on the Locked On Pacers podcast. We will start with OG Anunoby, and it's been probably the longest rumored Pacers target going back to summer of 2022, maybe. I mean, maybe after that is when the rumors started popping up. Pacers may not have been good enough in the summer of 2022. But either way, it's been a long time link. He went to Indiana, of course. He's a very good fit with the Pacers. He can shoot. He's wanted a little bit of a bigger role. The Pacers could have offered it. And of course, he can defend, one of the best, probably 10 defensive players, 5 defensive players in the NBA. The Pacers need those guys like crazy. Very good fit. No longer available, right? The short end of this is, I mean, yeah, the Knicks could trade him and trade him alone before February's deadline. But why would they do that? That would be stupid. It's over. The Knicks wouldn't have done this if they didn't think they could keep him. There's some agency ties that make that seem very obvious. It seems like OG Anunoby's with the Knicks for the long haul and not with the Pacers. So the starting thing a lot of people asked was, well, could the Pacers have beat this? Because the why is the Raptors clearly wanted quickly or something the Knicks were offering like now, right now, or else they could have done this closer to the deadline, seeing if they could have got better offers. Who knows if that Knicks offer still would have been there? I would assume so, but doing this now means they get those guys earlier, and that's valuable to them, right? So the comparable Pacers offer, I thought the first day of the trade, I thought about this, and I was talking to someone else who covers the Pacers about it at Pacers Knicks. And it's like, okay, RJ Barrett's in there for salary, going from the Knicks to the Raptors, and Emmanuel Quickley's a really good young player. And that second round pick is the Pistons second rounder, so it's the 31st pick. It's basically a first rounder, but it's not. But it's a good pick, right? So what is the comparable Pacers trade? And I thought about it, and I came up with what I thought it would be, and then I stopped. And I said, maybe this doesn't matter at all, because yes, you can, in theory, come up with a good Pacers young player and the salary and the pick and get to the equal value, air quotes, unequal value. But it doesn't mean that the Raptors value those things the same way that I do or you do or whatever. And so if they value Quickley more than any Pacers young player, and I would assume they do, Quickley is very good. Besides Tyrese Haliburton, obviously, like prospect young player on the Pacers, you get what I'm saying. Then it's impossible to come up with equivalent value, because just to use him as an example, not saying they even have equivalent trade value, but like Ben Mathurin, if they value Quickley more than Ben Mathurin, okay, well then the salary has to be different or the picks has to be different, right? So it's hard to come up with what this exact framework would have looked like from the Pacers. You can't just go, oh, Bruce Brown, Mathurin in a second, and that's it. Like, no, that's not the same, because how do the Raptors value Barrett, right? A Canadian who has been playing well for them in these 2 games. So it's not that easy. That said, if the Pacers had a chance to beat that, I think they should have thought about it, obviously. But the clear part of this is, and I think this is smart, I think a lot of teams, including the Pacers, who in the last 2 years have traded for Tyrese Haliburton, Aaron Nesmith, Jalen Smith, Obi Toppin, you could go on and on. There is clearly some teams shifting from, the picks package isn't as appealing. We want a good young player, right? And of course, that's always the thought, but is easier said than done. But clearly that had some value to the Raptors of like, what is 2 firsts to us? What is 2 bad firsts to us? If we can just get Emmanuel quickly, who we know is good and very valuable to have his restricted rights and have him for several years. So coming up with a comparable trade for what this would have looked like for the Pacers is a hard exercise and not really a fair exercise to me without knowing what the Raptors think of what the Pacers have. Because I think Zach Lowe said this well. Even if the Raptors had reported offers of 3 firsts for Anunoby or whatever it was, the quality of those firsts is not known, right? It's not like some team was offering 3 top 10 picks for OG Anunoby, and if you're offering 2 crappy firsts and 1 good first, well, the Raptors did better than that in the trade they got. So even going back in time and piecing all this together, it's hard to say what a comparable value would have been for the Pacers. That said, I would have offered a decent amount for Anunoby as the Pacers, probably about as much as the Raptors did in terms of what I would consider a comparable value, just because he's such a good fit. The fear being that he would leave, right? The CAA, Knicks connection, and that's Anunoby's agency, is obviously something here. And he'll be a free agent this summer, and there's some risks there. And like, he's a great fit on Philly, who's going to have cap space, and clearly the Knicks wanted it too. So the OG trade itself, I would have done a similar price should the Raptors have had one with Pacers assets than this trade. But I don't know that existed, and I can't say the Pacers should or shouldn't have done what the Raptors asked for without knowing what that is. But for the Pacers, OG Anunoby's off the board, right? He's now a Knick. Seems likely he'll resign there. I don't think the Knicks would have done this without knowing that they can keep him. So we'll see where that obviously heads, but cross him off as a trade target. They're not going to trade for a guy and then immediately flip him. But what does this mean for the Raptors? Where does this leave the Raptors? Because that is still a talking point for the Pacers, because a lot of reporting about Anunoby and the Pacers also was, connected with, Siakam, also Pascal Siakam, right? That buzz started at Summer League, and apparently the Hawks really wanted Siakam, and the Kings seemed like a sneaky fit for him as well. And so what are the Raptors really doing? And no one ever really knows, right? They just traded OG Anunoby on December 30th. No one ever really knows, but Siakam still a good fit with the Pacers. I said this on 1075 The Fan earlier this season. I think Siakam's a better fit with the Pacers than Anunoby personally. He's a very good player. The reason it's different is his salary is way different. So trading is not the same, right? The assets going out have to be different, and not more in terms of assets, but more salary means it's way different in terms of what that looks like. But before even thinking about what a Siakam to the Pacers trade looks like, you have to start with, will the Raptors even do this, right? They have changed directions, but I think they're better this season, right? And they have quickly now, they're 2-0 since the trade, right? They beat Cleveland and Memphis, 2 decent teams. They have quickly. He pairs well with Scotty Barnes. They have Barrett starting. They have Pascal. They traded for Jakob Poeltl, and they don't have their first-round pick this year. They traded it in that Poeltl trade. So, I get why they would move on from Siakam. The big picture reason is obvious. He's on an expiring contract, and losing players for nothing is not good, and it's happened to the Raptors a number of times, and a number is a stretch. They won a championship. They've obviously know what they're doing, but, they have to think about it. And Mark Stein reported that, I think it was Mark Stein, that Siakam, not considering an extension with anybody, wants to hit unrestricted free agency and maximize his earnings. Well, okay, that's going to scare away a lot of teams from trading for him, right? So it's a really interesting spot to think about what the Raptors will actually do with Pascal Siakam and what that means for his value, and if he's a rental, what that means for his value. So here's what I think about Pascal Siakam to the Pacers. He's a great fit, his shooting has kind of nosedived this year, which is interesting because part of what makes the Pacers so threatening all the time is everyone on their team, almost everybody who plays for them, is at least a willing shooter outside of basically, Isaiah Jackson in their rotation. Siakam this season, his 3-point attempts are down. His percentage is below 30. He's been a below average shooter for 4 straight seasons now, right? But beyond that, he's a phenomenal player, right? I think he's amazing. He has all these fun spin moves. He's very fast with the ball. He's a good finisher inside the arc. He is shooting a career high, not a career high, one of his best percentages from 2 this season, right? He's still a very efficient offensive player. Just throwing his shooting number out there is unfair. His true shooting percentage is his second best ever this year. Pascal Siakam is still very good. He's a good defender. He's tall. He can initiate a bit. His passing is fine. He doesn't turn it over. I don't need to sell you on two-time All-NBA player Pascal Siakam. He's awesome, and he would fit the Pacers really well. And I believe in his fit with the Pacers because he can create. And the Pacers have needed a second guy, consistent second guy next to Halliburton. But that said, the tricky part is what I already said. He's making a lot of money this season, and he makes a lot of money because he's good. But that makes trading for him tricky, right? Because you have to send out quite a bit to match salaries, and then he's a free agent next year, right? So you have to get up to almost 38 million to match up to almost 38 million. That's going to take one at least high salary player for the Pacers, which already means one of Field, Brown, or Turner's in there. And then you still have to get like a mid salary player and a low salary player in there, whether that's Toppin, Mather, and McConnell, and then, or Jarris Walker, and then one low salary player, or some machination of three things, right? And so already you're thinking about what the pick competition would be, and what young guys do the Raptors even want? Because clearly they're on the young guy side of things, and if you're the Pacers, you might be more interested in trading picks because you have young guys you like. So it's just hard to figure out what that would look like, and then you have to pay him next year for the Pacers, and all of a sudden, Tyrese Halliburton going to be making a ton of money? You have to think about the tax. There's a lot of hurdles, right? I don't want to get into exactly Pascal Siakam fake trades, but while I think he's a better fit than Anunoby with the Pacers, the trade is harder because of his salary, right? So this is still something that is, he's probably the most connected name to the Pacers on the market by reports, but still a lot to sort out on that front. Does it make sense? Yeah, absolutely. He's a great player. What would the trade look like? Too early to say, especially without knowing what the Pacers record is come February 1st and what the Raptors record is come February 1st. A lot more to talk about there, but that is where I think all that stands post Anunoby trade, where the Raptors are headed. And maybe Siakam just makes more sense on their new look team and they don't even think about it. Lots of stuff transactionally could be coming in the NBA. Today is an important day. Sunday is an important day. The Pacers are involved in it all, as usual, around this time of year. We got to talk about that. A contract deadline coming up, more trade thoughts, and the Atlanta Hawks. I've said trade thoughts twice in this podcast. Trade thoughts, and then the Hawks coming up here on Locked On Pacers. But first, we're going to talk about two lovely groups of people, starting with the great folks over at LinkedIn. It's the start of a new year, and every small business owner is asking the same question: what is the one move I can make that'll take my business to the next level in 2024? LinkedIn Jobs knows that your success all depends on the team you surround yourself with. That's why LinkedIn Jobs has created the tools to help find professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours on LinkedIn Jobs, and small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs number one in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn also knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. Thankfully, with LinkedIn, the process is intuitive, quick, and easy. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Also, this show is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's the new year, and around this time of year, we all get obsessed with changing ourselves instead of expanding what we already might be doing right. Maybe you finally organize one part of your space. Maybe you want to tackle something else in your life, or maybe you're taking your supplements every morning. Now you want to actually eat breakfast too. Therapy can help you find your strengths so you can ditch the extreme resolutions and make changes that really stick. Therapy can be helpful in many ways: positive coping skills, setting boundaries, empowering you to be the best version of yourself. It's not just for people who have experienced major trauma. And if you've ever thought of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire, get matched with a licensed therapist, and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Celebrate the progress you've already made. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. Back here on Locked On Pacers, thanks for making us your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, run on over to Locked On Nuggets or Locked On Warriors. Really awesome game. Warriors blow an 19-point lead. I watched that right before this. Jokic hits a almost 40-footer at the buzzer. Goes crazy. Awesome game. I mean, two fun teams to watch go against each other. Reigning Western Conference champions. Great game. And there'll be a lot to talk about on Locked On Nuggets and Locked On Warriors here on Locked On Pacers, We're going to continue talking about transactions because that's how January works in the NBA calendar. Today is January 5th. That might mean nothing to you, random listener. But today and this week, there are some key dates that start ramping up the transaction cycle in the NBA. January 5th specifically is the first one. So if you're listening on Friday, congrats. It's the first date. Today is the day teams can start signing 10-day contracts. I think that's a funny thing because in theory, like you could sign a player on December 26th to a non-guaranteed contract and then cut them. And that's a 10-day contract, but whatever. 10-day deals specifically as 10-day deals, which is different from a non-guaranteed deal, can be signed starting today if you have an open roster spot. To be clear, the Pacers don't have an open roster spot. So right this second specifically, that is not something that applies to them, but they have signed 10 days in recent seasons. It is something that has been a tool for them. If they end up with an open roster spot, perhaps it's something they could use, but be prepared to start seeing potentially some of those transactions from the cheaper teams or from teams that need depth or teams that have an open spot that might just want to use it to get another look at somebody else. But the other deadline that happens very soon, Saturday or Sunday to be in fact, I've said Saturday twice, Sunday to be in fact, the contract guarantee deadline. And this one does impact the Pacers and could, in theory, impact the 10-day market. I think we've talked about this every year here on Locked On Pacers, and most teams have a non-guaranteed contract on their team. But this is still something to know. It's something to monitor and think about what the Pacers would consider. So every contract in the league that is non-guaranteed becomes guaranteed if that player is still under contract come January 10th. Last year, remember O'Shea Brissett, James Johnson, both non-guaranteed. Their deals got guaranteed 2 years ago. Keelan Martin was non-guaranteed. He got waived before Lance Stevenson came in the door. O'Shea was non-guaranteed last year. It happens every year for the Pacers that they have to think about what to do if they're going to waive somebody, who is it, et cetera, et cetera. This year, they have one guy who has a non-guaranteed contract, and it's somebody they just added. It's James Johnson and his $1.427 million cap hit for the rest of the season. So they don't have to decide officially until Sunday. And I say Sunday because the deadline is the day that contracts become fully guaranteed is actually January 10th. But you have to fully have cleared waivers by then, which means you have to be done with waivers by the 9th. If you finish waivers on the 10th, that means you're under contract on the 10th and your deal would be guaranteed. So you have to be waived to go through waivers in 48 hours by the 7th. So while in theory, every contract becomes fully guaranteed on the 10th, which is Wednesday, the actual day that you have to be waived by to have your non-guaranteed deal stopped is Sunday. So Sunday is the deadline for the Pacers to waive James Johnson and free up some cap room. I don't have the exact amount in front of me because he's been under contract for whatever this is now, 3-ish weeks with the Pacers so far. I'd have to go back and look exactly when the fracas of the Milwaukee game was to figure out the day after that to figure it out. So his cap charge for those 3 weeks is in effect. But if they waive him, there would be two benefits. One would be the savings, whatever the difference is between the remainder they have to pay him and what they have paid him. They would gain in available cap space. And two would be a roster spot to do whatever they wanted, whether that's use it to sign somebody to a 10-day, whether it's to make an imbalanced trade, whether it's to make a signing of a different player. They could do it with a roster spot. They can't do it without a roster spot. That said, those sound like nice, fun advantages. Flexibility is nice. The Pacers love flexibility. Last year, they kept James Johnson through this deadline. They had cap space at the time, and this was before they extended Miles Turner. They used that space to do that. But they had space at the time, and they didn't need any more. They kept James Johnson, guaranteed his deal for the rest of the season. And they found him to be so valuable that they cut James Johnson to the trade deadline and then signed him again. And then this season, they have signed him again. Clearly, they recognize his value. They said they thought about bringing him in for training camp this year, but their guaranteed contract structure made that difficult. That's something Rick Carlisle shared, right? So clearly, the Pacers value him a lot. Every player gushes about him. His locker room presence is extremely valuable. They've already felt it this season in the few weeks he's been on the team. And they've signed him to 3 contracts they signed him originally in September of 2023. So they basically signed him to 3 contracts in 15 months. So I think that they value him and think he's worth the money. And that alone means maybe you just keep him, right? And they could do what they did last year. If they need to make an imbalance trade, okay, you waive him and then figure it out later. You can bring him back in a different way or waive somebody else later or whatever, because his contract is still the cheapest and the easiest to waive and bring him back. They were willing to pay him 2 contracts last year. What's the difference? Not much. So the reason would be if they really needed the extra, I'm just estimating like 1.1 or 1 million of cap space to do something, like Hield is still technically renegotiation extension eligible. If they need that space to make a trade specifically or something, then maybe they would waive him. But my gut tells me that they won't, and they'll just ride into the trade deadline with 15 guaranteed deals and whatever cap space that would be, 8.2 million basically in space, and work from there. And if they need to open up a roster spot, hey, they can do that by waiving James Johnson just like they did last year. They also had Terry Taylor and Gogo Batadze, remember. But if they really think they need the flexibility, I would understand it. There could be a lot in the air this year, especially with their increase in salaries coming next year due to Tyrese Halliburton's jump in finances. So perhaps they would value the flexibility. And, another factor to consider is they did this with Lance Stevenson. They don't need to do it this year. In fact, it would be kind of weird because then you defeat the whole savings purpose, but you do keep the roster spot flexibility. Would be they could waive James Johnson and then sign him to a couple 10 days between now and the trade deadline. And then once they get all that sorted out, then sign him to a deal for the rest of the year. And then you've, in theory, paid him 1 contract and not double pay him. But that's annoying. And 2 10-day contracts don't accumulate enough days to get you from the guarantee date all the way to the trade deadline. So there's a lot of moving parts there. They did it with Lance Stevenson, but they had the advantage of the hardship 10 days, and they still didn't get all the way to the trade deadline then, and they just guaranteed him right before it. So there are ways to get around this in theory. My gut says they'll just keep him like they did last year. Makes a ton of sense to do so. He has a lot of value to this team, but it is something to monitor. I'll talk about it a little bit next Monday, what they actually decided to do and what it means for the Pacers heading into the trade deadline. But I suspect I would do the same thing. I would just keep him. The benefits are not strong enough to have to either do the dance of 10 days or to lose that kind of leadership. But hey, they've been playing very well recently, and he's been a big part of their locker room success. Speaking of trades and the deadline, I want to talk a couple more thoughts I have on that. I did one show last month about several trade thoughts for the Pacers. I'll do a few more today without naming specific names. And I'll talk a little about the Hawks, the Pacers' opponent tonight. But before we do any of that, have to really quickly talk about someone new here. Hungryroot, the easiest way to get fresh, high-quality food delivered to your door. If you're trying to eat a little healthier in 2024, Hungryroot is here to rescue you from short-lived resolutions by making meal planning easy and nutritious. Building healthy habits that won't disappear by February is much easier with Hungryroot. They've got healthy groceries and simple recipes all in one place. They can make it easier for you to be healthy, right? They support all major diets, which is really helpful. It can help you save money because you're not shopping in the store and then getting stuff you don't need. And then you're also reducing food waste and you're saving time. And you can save money. You can take a fun short quiz on Hungryroot. We'll get to know you, your goals, how you like to eat, what flavors you like, all sorts of stuff like that. And all sorts of that stuff can be helpful. They'll recommend you recipes and groceries based on those tastes. They'll take the suggestions. You can choose anything you want. They've got fresh produce, high-quality meat, seafood, and pantry staples. And it goes beyond your weekly grocery haul with thousands of easy recipes that actually put your groceries to good use before they get forgotten and put back in the fridge. And the best part is Hungryroot follows a simple standard. It's got to taste good, be quick to make, and contain whole, trusted ingredients. So spend less time meal planning, shopping, and cooking, and more time enjoying healthy food that you'll actually love with Hungryroot. Right now, Hungryroot is offering Locked On NBA Friday listeners and Locked On Pacers listeners 40% off your first delivery and free veggies for life. Just go to hungryroot.com/lockedon to get 40% off your first delivery and get your free veggies. That's hungryroot.com. Don't forget to use our link so they know that we sent you. Back here on Locked On Pacers, thanks for making us your first listen today and every single day. Make your second listen Locked On Hawks. Hear about the opponent's perspective. Hawks not playing the greatest recently, but not ascending a little, I guess, from their slump. They need to be better, and tonight will be a chance for them to do so. We'll talk about them in just a second. A couple trade thoughts for the Pacers as we hit January. 10 days until everybody who will be available to be traded, basically everybody who will be available to be traded this season will be on January 15th. The first thing I want to muse about is, does this recent stretch matter for the Pacers? And the way you think about that, to me, says a lot about what you think of where the Pacers are as a team right now, right? If you think that their 5-game winning streak right now is indicative of a team on the rise that should be prioritizing the short term, you probably have thought that all season. And you thought after their losing streak and slump when they were 500 that they should be sellers, and now maybe think they should be buyers. And I said this last month, have thought that they still need to be thinking long-ish term, because they have Tyrese Haliburton under contract for 6 years. And in theory, it depends on what moves they make this season and maybe next summer, could have one more chance at cap space. Could. Let me be clear. Could. I think a lot of people keep talking about the Pacers cap space, and I don't necessarily think it's going to be a thing, but it could be. So I still think right now I would be thinking long-term, similar to how I was before the season. But a 5-game winning streak and being 5th in the East come January certainly changes your thinking a bit. Although remember, they were 5 games over 500 at the halfway point last season, and then did not have as good of a second half for a number of reasons. Either way, this recent stretch to me would not change my goals as the Pacers, but I get how it could make I'm not saying this is, I'm just picking a name. Like, say the Pacers want to upgrade on at the 4 and they get PJ Washington, right? Like, that trade makes more sense than it did if you're a 500 team, right? Sending out assets for a minor upgrade makes more sense if you're good than if you're mediocre. So that's the only change I think that has happened in the last, 2 weeks. But they have to keep it up for that to even matter, right? If they lose 3 in a row, all of a sudden, those become dumb trades again. So those are very context dependent, but I think that's an important thing to note as the trade deadline approaches. I still think, I've said this on this show, I said this talking to Caitlin Cooper on the Basketball She Wrote podcast, I still think I'd be indexing hard on defense for any target, right? If there's any sort of tiebreaker, I think on this Pacers team with Tyrese Haliburton, anyone can at least reach their individual peak offensively. But if you can defend and you can be an individual defender, that would be what I would be thinking important if I'm the Pacers. And if you can get a young wing, obviously everybody wants those. But if you can get one as the Pacers, I'd be hunting them hard. I still think that is the case. Something I think is a moderately small but still noteworthy storyline to watch for the Pacers heading into the deadline that hasn't really been discussed and probably won't be until later in January is, what do they think of their expiring contracts, right? Do they know enough to know what their plans are with those guys? Buddy Hield is one of their expiring contracts. He's in a down stretch right now. Obi Toppin's one of their expiring contracts. Pacers have enjoyed what he has done this season. He's been playing well coming off the bench. And Jordan Nwora, who has no role at all. And perhaps Jalen Smith, who's on a player option, but I would not. That's harder to say. Either way, do we learn anything about how the Pacers feel about those players leading up to the deadline? Because they're going to be interesting names to watch just because of their contract situation, right? And Toppin's restricted, so it's a little different. The Pacers still have team control with him beyond this season, but those guys in particular who can be free agents this summer, what their status for the next month leading up to the deadline is going to be important. To be a big cap space team, the Pacers would have to lose some of those guys anyway, right? So if you're going to lose them to sign somebody, are you willing to just lose them now to trade for that player early, for example? That's something they'll have to consider, and an argument to think about if, say, like they trade those guys for a Siakam or for a whoever, right? Is, well, if they would have had to lose those guys to sign that player in free agency, it's effectively just getting the guy earlier. But obviously other assets would be involved. I mentioned this earlier, but like if you get a Siakam or if you get a whoever else that's an expiring contract, like maybe you feel good about re-signing them because you have recruiter Tyrese Haliburton on your team, but the luxury tax could be a concern if you get an expensive player. So it's worth thinking about that if you're the Pacers as the trade deadline approaches. Those are just some things I think people aren't talking enough about or thinking enough about when prioritizing the Pacers' future, but a lot of those things are perhaps long-term problems that are not necessarily something they need to think of. I mean, they obviously think about this stuff every day. It's their job, but like really index on now, it's just stuff that should be considered as you think about what the Pacers could or should do in the coming trade deadline. But it'll be fascinating to see. Next year, I think, will be a very heavy transaction year for the Pacers. Just, if you look at their cap sheet, it's very obvious. Potentially, you're going into a contract year for Bruce Brown and Miles Turner and Jalen Smith and Isaiah Jackson and probably Andrew Nembhard, right? Like that alone makes 2024-25 interesting. And that doesn't even account for whatever they do between now and then. They have 2 first-round picks. So figuring some stuff out now makes some sense, but it has to be the right stuff. And I still think thinking long-term is a big factor in that. They play the Hawks tonight. I'm really far into the show, so I won't say too much about this. I just always like to at least fit in some talk about actual basketball games when I can. This, for lack of a better term, trap game potential here, right? Big high, beating the Bucks twice in a row, beating any team twice in a row is hard in the NBA. Beating a team that kicked your butt for years twice in a row is very impressive. The Celtics are looming right behind the Hawks, right? A very good team. Another chance for the Pacers to prove themselves against a team that beat them by 50 earlier this season. And the Hawks are in the middle, a team the Pacers have already beaten and have shown their style can take down. This is something they talked about after the Bucks, right? It shows maturity that they are better against Milwaukee. Can they apply that to other teams that they should be better than, like Atlanta? I think it has trap game potential, and I think it'll be interesting to see how the Pacers get up and play this game. Trey's been playing better. So, and by better, I mean phenomenally good. So seeing how they handle him and how he plays is going to be very interesting. But with the Pacers playing better defense, right? They're the nadir of their defense this season was in Atlanta on that just miserable game. People love that game. I hated that game. 157, 152 is gross. If their defense is better, can their offense reach a high enough level to just easily score on the Hawks all night like they did that night? A lot of interesting stuff coming in this game to me. If the Pacers offense hums like it has been, they'll be fine. But Trae Young's amazing and can make the Hawks threatening every night. They got a good win over the Thunder earlier this week. We'll, of course, talk about it on the Locked On Pacers podcast probably next Monday. Next Monday, we'll talk Hawks and Celtics, both Pacers opponents from this weekend, and anything else that may happen. And, of course, whatever they decide on doing with James Johnson. You will get the scoopage and discussion here on the Locked On Pacers podcast. Thank you all for listening. You could find me on Twitter at Tony R. Easton, this show at Locked On Pacers. Best way to reach me and talk about the things that we talked about on this podcast. Everybody have a fantastic weekend. Enjoy the 2 games we're going to talk about on Monday. Till then, have a great day.